1232nd day of the war, Trump was bitten by a dog of adequacy. He suddenly woke up and realized that Putin is such a terrible person who still does not respect him. The American president said that he was dissatisfied with Putin and that he was preparing surprises for him. It also became known that the injunctional law of Lindsey Graham would be considered in a few days. Again, it is difficult to say how exactly he will act in the event of adoption, but more pressure levers are always better than less pressure levers. In addition, Trump also said that the United States will support Ukraine in arms. The Zetniks recognize the successes of the Ukrainian troops in Sumy and note the strikes by FABs on the counterattacking forces of the Soviet Union, which are moving forward in the region. Successful actions of the defense forces in the Lyman direction have also been confirmed. The offensive of Russia, in the meantime, continues along the entire front line. On the eastern flank of the Pokrovskaya direction, the Russians led a rare and at the same time relatively successful mechanized assault. Part of the equipment was destroyed as well as the personnel. It is not yet clear whether it was possible to secure the remains. At the same time, the Russian military is killing its co-workers who decided to give up. Ukrainian journalist Andrei Tsaplienko told about this, bringing the corresponding video. New details about the pipe operation appeared. It was organized poorly, the soldiers were dying right there, someone went crazy from a lack of air. There were big problems with water and the Amatovci were separately separated, picking up provisions from other soldiers. One of the participants of this operation told about the details. Russian super-secret UAV Altair, which has been developed for a long time, collapsed in Kazan. It fell on a private house in the Asant Dubki. This happened after the influence of the RAP system, according to official data, apparently Russian, because where does the Ukrainian system come from in Kazan? About this and much more in today's fresh summary, which you can support with your like, comments, and subscription to the channel. Especially relevant today because many of you may have noticed that you did not see yesterday's summary. This happened not because it was not there, but because YouTube very strongly limited it, as the following video. He put 18+. The problem is not that there is 18+, but the problem is that when he puts 18+, it is impossible to go and watch the video without registration on YouTube. Moreover, he does not give it out practically in recommendations, so the old man made a summary yesterday. Therefore, if you missed it, first of all, look, and secondly, I hope today will achieve a different fate. Also, you can support the channel financially. You can do it on Patreon, the link is in the description. And by buying NVPN, this is a means for bypassing blockages that allows you to bypass blockages, watch YouTube at normal speed, use Twitter, Instagram. Twitter is now especially interesting to use. Their grog is a little twisted, and he blew up the 5th point from a large number of Zetniks, but we may talk about this in a separate video. I have not decided yet, but I think the story is cool. So, in general, there is a lot you can use from what is blocked in Russia. You can buy NVPN by the link in the description. Well, this will certainly support this channel. Also, the purchase of VPN. The use of VPN in Russia is still legal. But we are moving on to what happened in the past 24 hours, and there's quite a lot of interesting stuff there. So, Trump yesterday said such a thing about Putin that these words were immediately disassembled into a quote that you probably got. Full selection in a good translation leads to the channel B or Putin throws so much beep at us, said Trump at the cabinet meeting as a result of the first half of his presidency. I'm not satisfied with Putin. This is what I can tell you now because he kills many people and many of them are his soldiers. He was asked, are you not satisfied with Putin? Are you planning to do something? I wouldn't tell you, said Trump. Don't you want a little surprise? We gave the Ukrainians 300 billion, Europe gave 100, but regardless of whether you consider it unfair that we gave them so much money, the Ukrainians were very brave, said Trump. We have the best military equipment in the world, everything else is not even close, so everyone wants to buy our equipment. That's why we're going to build these contracts so that they can do it perfectly, but they do it too slowly. We need to tighten their pits so that they can do it much faster, said Hex. Unfortunately, we need to do it, said Trump. We have so much bullshit that Putin is throwing at us, you know, he's always so cute all this time, but it all makes no sense at all, said Donald Trump. And so, not even half a year has passed since Trump woke up and began to say the right things, ready to admit that at the beginning of the new term he sincerely respected Putin and hoped to take revenge on him for the Ukrainian problem that hinders their bromance. However, it turned out that Putin did not put Trump or his peaceful effort in anything. I don't want to nod, but it seems to me that the tectonic shift in the worldview of the American president has come. Now we will wait until this is converted into some real actions that are still missing. But the first body movement in the right direction is already noticeable. Trump said that any country entering the BRICS will face additional 10% tariffs, and the US president wrote his network True Social and confirmed this at a press conference. They must pay 10% if they enter the BRICS because the BRICS was created to harm us. The BRICS was created to weaken our dollar and eliminate it as a world standard. If they want to play this game, please, but I also know how to play such games, said Trump. From any country that joins the BRICS anti-American policy, an additional tariff of 10% will be taken from this policy, will not be said in the publication. In addition, former Speaker of the House of Representatives Newt Gingrich stated that the law on the project of Lindsey Graham and sanctions will be imposed on Wednesday. Same sanctions from hell and giant secondary tariffs on trade with Russia, which was constantly postponed, either due to Trump's indecisiveness or due to the escalation in the Middle East. Let's hope that this is the surprise promised to Trump and Putin and that it will really work out somehow. With arms supplies, everything is not so joyful. The United States has only 25% of the ZRK Patriot interceptor missile reserves needed to carry out the Pentagon military plans. The Guardian reports on this. The publication indicates that the low level of reserves of key air defense means to reflect ballistic threats led to the fact that the Trump administration suspended their supplies to Ukraine. U.S. President Donald Trump apparently canceled at least part of this decision when he declared to journalists in White House with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that Ukraine will send a little more weapons. The Axios publication, referring to its sources, reported that Trump, in a phone conversation with Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky, promised to immediately send 10 ZRK Patriot interceptor missiles to Ukraine. Let me remind you, in the package that was stopped in Poland there were 30 such missiles, but all the figures are conditional because this is Trump. Trump does not understand the figures and says them off the top of his head. According to this published by The Guardian, the reserves of a number of critically important ammunition are below the minimum level needed to implement the operational plans of the U.S. Armed Forces. The situation deepened after last month Iran launched a missile strike on the El Udeid airbase in Qatar. To intercept Iranian ballistic missiles, the United States launched about 30 Patriot missiles. Thus, the United States has only about 25% of Patriot interceptor missiles needed to carry out all Pentagon military plans. After the last month, a significant part of the reserves were spent in the Middle East, they wrote. This will also affect plans to expand additional complexes in the region to support companies against Hussites in Yemen. According to sources, the Trump administration began to review the levels of the Patriot missiles and other ammunition that were exhausted in February. It should be noted that this information contradicts the earlier news of NBC News, according to which the head of the U.S. Defense Ministry suspended the supply of weapons to Ukraine, despite the assessment that this does not pose a threat to the country's defense capability. The assessment showed that the stock of some high-precision ammunition is at a lower level, but has not yet reached a critical mark. At the same time, it is not known whether this assessment was related to the specific rocket of the Patriot interceptors. Well, I have to say that it probably makes more sense for the American NBC to believe more than the British Guardian. They are kind of closer to the sources. Moreover, the Trump administration and its various representatives, as I said, use Russian practice quite well. They use their influence to justify their own decisions. That's why Colby and Pete Hexon, who were the initiators of the ceasefire, and moreover, according to the American media, even without knowing about it, Trump. Maybe they are trying to justify their behavior in some way. That's why I would note it all with an asterisk, because again, the information is based on sources. We don't know what kind of sources they are, how sincere they are, how well informed they are. That's why we write it all down with a pencil. At the same time, the U.S. has officially confirmed the resumption of the supply of weapons to Ukraine in the State Duma. This was stated in the briefing by the State Duma Speaker Temi Bryas. We were and remain the biggest supporters of Ukraine. We are not indifferent to these people and the fact that they have everything necessary, she stressed. Bryas recalled that earlier she called on not to make hasty conclusions about the temporary suspension of aid. In her words, President Donald Trump is determined to ensure the ability of Ukraine to defend itself. This is our firm obligation, added the State Duma representative. How hard it is and how it is converted into anything once again, even if all aid will be restored in the same volume, including what was done by the USAI, which is the supply of plants, and by the PDA, which is Biden's presidential initiative. Even if all this will be restored, then we will still return to point zero. This is not the point where Trump allocates something additional. This is not the point where Trump spends at least $1 approved, by the way, part of which is approved by the Congress. $5 billion still remains under the PDA for the support of Ukraine. Therefore, a real change and a real decisive transformation of the head of Trump can be recorded when everything really turns to the fact that some new packages of aid will be issued. Then it will be possible to say, yes, the United States is again an ally and one of the main allies of Ukraine. But the trend that we see is also interesting. Moreover, if you pay attention, we discussed with you the last few weeks everything that is happening with the states. I told you that I think Trump's tonality has changed, and at the NATO summit and in front of him and just before the stop of aid, it looked like a big surprise to me. I had two hypotheses. The first is that there is chaos inside the Pentagon, that again this is someone's personal decision. And the second is that Putin offered something. As we see, Putin did not offer anything, he offered to kiss himself in the ass. And indeed, it was all connected with the chaos in the Pentagon. That is, according to the Kolb initiative, this is the political advisor to the Pentagon, or what position he has there, I do not remember. PeteHegseth once again, for the fourth time, stopped the supply of weapons in Ukraine, and out of these 4 times, only one time it was agreed with Donald Trump. That is, after the scandal in the Oval Office between Vladimir Zelensky and the President of the United States, Donald Trump. I hope that's well okay, PeteHegseth, somehow they communicate nicely with Trump. I hope that it will be quite difficult to put him down now. But after the first stop in arms, the advisor of PeteHegseth was fired, who mocked him for this. I hope that now Colby will lose his post, it would be great. And I completely agree that PeteHegseth is also doing this, what is called not out of evil mind, but he's just a moron. We know this is a proven fact. This is an alcoholic, a moron, the host of Fox News, who has no profile experience for the job he does. The fact that it can be introduced by anti-Ukrainian representatives of the United States inside the political system is also very possible. This does not make PeteHegseth better than Donald Trump. I am against the concept of the czar of good and the bayer of the bad, but let's say this makes the situation less vulnerable. That is, if it were PeteHegseth's plan, if it were Donald Trump's plan, then what could be done about it? There would not be so many tools, and given that this is a plan of some separate dudes who just hate Ukraine, here you can make some decisions from the countries of the international community for pressure. Well, that is, American partners in European countries from the side of Ukrainian diplomacy, which was done, as you can see. Now deliveries are coming back and Trump threatens Putin with surprises. Well, let's see how these surprises will look. Fortunately, Ukraine has unconditional friends whose help on their part does not depend on the current leader's left foot and with what mood that person in the state will wake up. Germany plans to additionally allocate €13.6 billion to help Ukraine in the following years. This is said in the press release of the 16th session of the German government's meeting. For the support of Ukraine, €8.3 billion were allocated to expand the opportunities of states that have been attacked by the violation of international law, the sphere of security, defense, and stabilization, as well as an additional €13.6 billion in the form of obligations for the following financial years, it is said on the website. The budget for the next year must be approved by the Cabinet of Ministers at the end of this month and transferred to Parliament in August. Finance Minister, Vice-Chancellor of the FRG Lars Nigbehill emphasized the need for investment in internal and external security, for example, the resettlement of the German armed forces. I know how many people find it difficult to accept the fact that the war has returned to Europe, but our own forces are a prerequisite in order for us to return to the real world in Europe, where borders cannot be moved by force, he said, and confirmed further support. For Ukraine, what can I say? The Germans are cool. Mers is doing absolutely fine at his post, and the team that he gathers and the new missions inside the German, inside the German bureaucracy, probably well in general, the Ministry of Everything else is very happy, really reliable, good partner of Ukraine who understands what is happening, understands the threats and acts accordingly. Well, the main support for Ukraine is, of course, the Ukrainian armed forces, and we continue to help them because this is what affects right here and now. Again, due to the fact that YouTube actually killed yesterday's poll, we did not get much with you on the collection, and well, it's not very good because, I'm not so worried about the views on YouTube. Well, that is, I do what I do not for the sake of some views or figures, but because I believe that it is important, and I have 2 indicators that are oriented. These are the gatherings that we managed to close, and in fact, so that people stop going to the Russian army, deserted from it. The first one I can track, well, I just have a table, I can track my KPI. The second one, well, I respectively ask the audience, including how they come, they do not come there, from my videos, not from my videos, and so on. So the gatherings are an important component for me. This is what helps to save the lives of Ukrainians here and now, what helps Ukraine to stop Russian aggression. So thank you very much to everyone who participates in them. We continue with you to collect on a car for a new unit for 2 cars. Here is a message from the fighters. We wish you good health. We are a battalion of unmanned systems new. We turn to Mike Nacke and his community for help in closing the collection of car transport for our unit. Glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. Here is the QR code for the Monobank in the description of the Monobank. PayPal, USD, Bitcoin, CryptoShake, and Connect in general. Let's help the fighters to get cars. Unfortunately, cars are often killed. Well, this is what suffers very much without Cars, there is no mobility on the front, especially for units that are engaged in infantry units. Yes, which are engaged in such a face-to-face fight, including for drones, units, and so on. Cars are an important component of their capabilities, so all the links to the collection in the description. Let's help, of course. Today I will also participate, but we move on news of the unannounced war of Russia against Europe here. If the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, understands that Russia is fighting with Europe, then apparently in other countries this is not fully understood. By 3 people in Britain are accused of burning a warehouse with help for Ukraine with the help of Ukraine on the order of the CWK Wagner. The jury took out a verdict. The guilt of 23-year-old Jake M. Rose, 20-year-old Agni with a shift, and 23-year-old Nemenza. The attack was organized by 20-year-old Dylan Earl and 23-year-old Jake Rives, who had previously confessed to the guilt in the organization of the fire on the order of the CWK Wagner. While another suspect, 61-year-old Paul English, is considered innocent of receiving funds from foreign intelligence for the organization of the fire. Another figure in the case, Ashton Evans, was found guilty of a less serious crime. He did not tell the authorities about the preparation of the terrorist attack. The 6th person in the process, Demetrius Polskos, was found innocent on the same charge. The building in the east of London, where the warehouses of the Odyssey and Mist UK companies were located, they belonged to the Ukrainian businessman Michael Prokhodko. His wife Alina Boyko was set on March 2024. Fire extinguishing took part in 60 firefighters. The fire damage amounted to about £1 million. The main figure in the case was Dylan Earl. He was charged with the organization of the set fire on the order of the CHVK Wagner. Claimed that Earl came into contact with the curator of the CHVK Wagner in Britain. It is recognized as a terrorist organization, is prohibited, after which he went to study the building that was about to set fire to the case. Earl, the first resident of the Great Britain, who was convicted of recently adopted law against espionage and foreign interference in general in the Great Britain, one of the first, should have felt the effect of war Russia against Europe, if not after the killing of Litvinenko, then when the British citizen Don Sturgis died from Russian chemical weapons of a newcomer applied to the territory of the Great Britain. However, it seems to me all these Russian events, in quotes, did not pass without a trace of the Great Britain of the Netherlands, whose citizens Russia killed at the defeat of the Malaysian Boeing, and the Czech Republic, where the game exploded the warehouses of ammunition, is now in the ranks of the most faithful allies of Ukraine. Putin, in this sense, tarnished in the first place himself and continues to do this. But it is very important that the European countries still take more adequately the threat and counteract it. Russian terror in the front areas does not stop for a day. In Kherson, the Russian military dropped an explosive from a drone on a civilian car. The driver died as a result of an attack of UAVs in the city. 12 civilians were wounded in a day from July 7 to 8 as a result of shelling in 13 settlements in the Donetsk region. 3 people were killed, 10 were injured, reported to the National Police of Ukraine. On July 7, artillery VSRF shelled the village of Kutkovka in the Kubinsky district. 55-year-old women were killed. Private house ownership. Ukrainian intelligence called the name of one of the Russian officers who, as it is claimed, was preparing an attack on the Children's Hospital of Ahmed dead in Kiev. As the head of the intelligence department of the Defense of Ukraine claims, this is about Major of the VSRF Denis Shainov, the head of the Special Engineering Service. The 121st Heavy Bombardment Aviation Regiment, 22 Heavy Bombardment Aviation Division, according to the government of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. This unit was involved in an attack on the Kiev Hospital of Ahmed dead, where at the time of the blow to the treatment there were 627 children. Shainov was responsible for the organization of technical training of winged rockets H-101 for the allocation of strategic aviation aircraft. It is said in the message. The guru also indicated that Shainov was born in Saratov. There he graduated from a military school, and in 2018, the Russian military served as part of the SRF of Syria. The guru of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine published this information in the anniversary of the Russian attack on the Children's Hospital of Ahmed dead in Kiev. In general, Shainov is now worth going with a look, but even if the SBU presents his suspicions in a war crime, then in general too. Cover yourself with a sheet and crawl towards the cemetery, while remembering that any participation in Russian military crimes puts you on the map. A mark on the map appears in the form of your name and last name, and then it does not matter what you use, a scooter or a car or something else to eliminate, and consequences if not inevitable, then it is very likely that Russian terror of the civilian population of Ukraine is carried out with the silent help of Western companies. This showed an investigation of the Independent Anti-Corruption Commission of International Partnership on Human Rights. Hunter Brook media investigators studied 180,000 customs documents and found 141 Western companies, whose components ultimately turn out to be Russian planes. More than 1,100 electronic components used in the production of planes Su-35 have a foreign origin. The vast majority of local roots come from the USA. First of all, this is the products of the analog devices company Intel, AMD, and Texas Instruments, but there are also products from Japan and the US for two-thirds of the year in Russia, it was possible to introduce electronic components leading to Western manufacturers for a sum of more than $800 million. Some Russian companies participating in the supply chain openly advertised the parallel import of sanctioned goods. Journalists. Investigators again do work for the organs of the sanctioned supervision, which is not clear why they give money to taxpayers. And with Trump began to work worse than that. If the trauma really wants to help Ukraine, it will have to recreate the system of supervision for sanctions destroyed by themselves, and this task is not easy. At the same time, if the sanctions start to work as intended, then Russia will not be able to produce anything. It itself simply does not know the weakness of the sanctioned regime allows Russia to use not only Western products. Documents Russian drones are carried out a straight line from China to the sky of Ukraine, reports Bloomberg. Russian company Arrowhead set up mass production of military drones with Chinese help after the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Russian company Arrowhead received a state subsidy to turn the production of FPV drones in Veles and Khabarovsk. The plant is able to produce up to 10,000 drones a month, actively supplying the army of the RF, in particular in the Kherson region, according to documents Arrowhead since the end of 2022. Worked with Chinese companies including Auto Robotics and suppliers from Harbin despite their official denial through intermediaries. Details of the firmware and production of the bar were purchased later. The company Shenzhen Hoseng Industry, which was sanctioned the US, was connected to the project. The documents indicate that the drones were assembled from Chinese components, and the project was coordinated with the representatives of the defense of the Russian Federation. In March 24, one of the units in Pskova requested 100 drones through a company related to the company Aeroflot. China continues to deny the supply of weapons. However, the Bloomberg documents show a stable supply of components of a double purpose, and the REF creates infrastructure for further localization of production and bypass of sanctions. The Veles drone is actively used for attack on Ukrainian cities, causing damage and to the civilian population. The Ukrainian Arson channel Dnipro Garbus brings satellite images of the consequences of one blows in the chain of production of shacks. The channel comments the image so satellite images of the consequences of the blow. And 196 Luddy on the new AOV-NIR Progress Workshop in Cheboksary on July 5. The workshop produces adaptive antenna bars of a comet that is used in drones. Jaran drone pierced the roof of the workshop, and we will hope to do things inside. In turn, in one of the projects of the Cyber Boroshno published photos of the blow to the factory in Ozov applied last week. Analysts conducted photos with the following comment: as a result of the attack of 47 BPA of the Defense Forces of Ukraine, 2 buildings of the Ozov optical mechanical plant were destroyed. It is at this plant that high-precision optical mechanical nodes are produced, which are used in missile guidance systems, stabilizers for armored vehicles, navigation and laser devices for aviation and BPA systems, as well as radioelectronic warfare. The plant became part of the import and replacement chain after the introduction of sanctions. Here they set up the production of components that were previously supplied from the Est, and Israel Zetniks begin to recognize Ukrainian counterattacks on Sumshina, which were previously told by Ukrainian war explorer Konstantin Mashevitz. In particular, this is what Zetwin blogger Anatoly Radov writes: the Sum region, our aviation works with fabs on Ushniks who try to surround Marpakov of the 40th Brigade in Kondratovka, another place where the Ukrainians have created a small counteroffensive. He writes, the footage of the application of these very fabs will be published. In particular, Zet channel fighter bomber close to VCS Russian command is so seriously receiving a small counteroffensive that even 3 tons of air bombs did not spare for its stop. Let's see what will come of this on the eastern flank of the Pokrovsky direction. The Russians have led a rare and, at the same time, a relatively successful mechanized assault, they say in the Sin channel. In factum, that's what they write there. The Russians for 3 BMP and metal games like a shed and drove into the new economic direction of Myrnohrad. The left phase of the Pokrovskaya can be seen a few losses of the technique of landing infantry with a blow into the bucket with a drop. It is not known whether the Russians managed to fix themselves in the village, but as you can see, they drove along the populated point quite far. The authors of the channel admit, as we can see, the allocation of armored vehicles allows the USAF to achieve certain successes. This is why its absence positively affects the perspective of the Ukrainian defense in Toretsk. After numerous battles, the Russians finally took control of the micro-district of Zabalko with the help of the deep state map. Nevertheless, it was not possible to achieve full control of the city. In the USAF so far, although Russia declared its capture on February 7 of this year in this regard, it raises concerns about the advance of the Russian forces to Yavlanovka, northern Toretsk. Also, according to the deep state, in the event of a blockade of logistical routes, the Ukrainian defenders may have to leave Toretsk at last. However, when this happens, I would not guess, given the still more modest successes of the Russians in this direction. As for the southern Donetsk region, the situation in this direction remains acute. The Ukrainian units have to leave the semicircle. One of such cases was told in the deep state. 1st Battalion of the 31st Separate Mechanized Brigade left the North Ravnopol pocket. Analysts said, the long epic of holding a complex area of the front surrounded by 3 sides was completed. All the fighters who were in position were able to leave as a whole. Only one received a Light injury at the exit of the garrison of this area in the last 1.5 months did not enter the fight so often, since the enemy decided to move along the route through Novopol. Although before that there were fierce fights, even mortar calculations were forced to carry out a shooting battle, in general, the Battle of the 31st. MBR showed resilience and lasted much longer than was required, another feat of the Ukrainian infantry. There's a lot of such things on the front. The deep state marks the deep stage, which once the last day fixes the progress of the Russians in the Kamensk and Zaporizhzhia directions, the project is separately stopped at the Russian offensive actions in the area of Lebkovo and Stepov. After the activation of Russian armed forces in March and the active promotion at the end of the same month, the station managed to stabilize and the Russians were unable to develop the pace of their success in the Lebkovo area, the small shards of shards tell the deep state. However, the purely outstanding Russian infantry in this area continues to press on the position of the Ukrainian Defense Forces, as well as almost on all other areas of the front. The Russians also have a rather powerful support for drones that strike both fighters and any movement that they fix in order to complicate the holding of the positions. With constant pressure, they managed to take the front one and secure themselves in it. They bypassed it from all sides and climb in this area like cockroaches, hiding in buildings, basements, ruins, and so on. Our pilots are constantly on the Russians and try to destroy them as much as possible. For example, they listen to the squadrons of the hunt in the northern outskirts of the village. The same situation is observed in the steppe area and in general throughout the entire line of combat clashes in this area. The technique in this area is not used. Small groups of infantry climb in, most often several people hide, concentrate in some place and continue to crawl further. So-called invisible areas are actively used, which complicate the discovery of the enemy when moving. Not a new thing on the front, but we often hear in talks about the use of such areas in different areas. We also often hear that Moscovites do not run through landings and fields during assaults to some point, but slowly crawl, spending more time on this, but increasing the chance to approach the Ukrainian positions as close as possible and survive during a drone hunt. Not a new tactic, but the mention of this has been taken into account. The fighters the defense forces continue to hold their positions. The pilots are actively trying to hunt the Russian infantry and destroy it, but the horde of Moscovites, indifferent to losses, often still achieve certain results. You need more means of defeat, includes in the deep state about a typical case on the same Zaporizhzhia direction. The Ukrainian journalist Andrei Tsiplienko told the Russians killed his comrade with a drone in an attempt to surrender in captivity in the area of Orkhov. One of the Russian military decided to raise his hands and, following the instructions, went for the Ukrainian drone, wrote Tsiplienko. The command noticed that the soldier with his hands raised surrendered to the Ukrainians and gave an order to open fire. Russian command. First, a few mines flew over the Russians, but they did not touch him and he continued the movement. Then, according to his own fighter, the Russians launched an unmanned type of lightning which is controlled the same way as an FPV drone. Ukrainian scouts watched how the person next to him went to surrender. Ammunition fell and then a drone hit him, but in this situation they could not help him. Therefore, the Russians who want a surrender to the captivity should contact the Ukrainian Center for Receiving and Conquering from the servicemen in advance. The plenum is advised, and I agree with him. It may be dangerous for the Russians to surrender during the fight because their own troops will try to kill them. This is not the first case when we observe this. This happened earlier, and this is really a big danger. Therefore, it makes sense not to fall into the Russian army if you fall into a desert before the fights, and if you are afraid to desert, then you will agree with the Ukrainian military about the place where your surrender will be carried out, and you will fall into Ukrainian captivity where, again, there are no torturous conditions and all international norms are observed. The Ukrainian counterattack under the Red Kodub continues to develop, recognizes the war blogger Anatoly Radov. Ukrainians in some areas are starting to switch to small counterattacks, perhaps again to demonstrate to the US that they still have reserves and therefore need the supply of weapons. Moreover, such small counterattacks take place at the same time with our advance on the same sites. He is surprised. In the Lebanese direction, the US increased the zone of control in the Ret Kodub and regularly throws in the village Nunu triplets. At the same time, our fighters came close to the village of Glushchenkovo. Radov notes. Even, it would seem, not quite yet departed Zetnik does not understand that the goal of such counterattacks is not political, but rather operatively tactical. They are designed to slow down the Russian offensive and force the Russians to try to return the lost positions instead of moving forward. In fact, we saw something like this in the Pokrovsky direction, thanks to which, at the beginning of the year, it was possible to stop the Russian offensive at this site. I then released a separate video about this. You can watch it on DOSUGI to understand how it works. There was an official comment in the Soviet Union about the transition of the Russian borders to the Kharkiv region, which was recently told in deep state. After a day, the Russians activated in the area of the settlement of Milovo. This is a village to the northeast of the village of Veliki Burluk, where the Russian infantry crossed the state border and attacked our positions with the support of artillery and drones, quotes representatives of the operative tactical group of the Kharkiv Pavlo Shamshin, Ukraine, inform. According to Shamshin, the Russian military was stopped, then the Russians changed direction of movement and moved in the direction of the Hapnoy village, but they were also stopped there. He added, according to him, they were able to stabilize the situation. There is no further offensive of the Russian troops. It remains to be hoped that this time the official comments do not coincide with the reality in which the Ukrainian speakers repeatedly elated in the same deep state. Shamshin admitted that the situation in the Kharkiv region remains complex. The Russian military continues to press in the Volchansk region, which is located not far from another section of the Russian-Ukrainian border. The resource Akagora publishes an infographic on the progress of the Russian troops over the past week from June 30 to July 6. In this period, the Russians were moving on an average of 32 square kilometers a day. As in the previous 3 weeks, 15 of their thoughts on the scale of the kilometers I said yesterday in the report, which was strongly limited by YouTube. But look, I'll just say that you need to look at the next week. If the trend remains, this will mean that the Russians really increase the pace of the offensive, and then you will have to think about why this happened and how to solve the accumulated problem. There is still a curious statistics of the current of the mountains. According to the data of the Ukrainian military in June, the frequency of the use of the air bomb with the MPK module fell by 22% compared to May. The Russians launched a little more than 100 bombs a day in total in the past month. 3,219 bombs were launched, while in April record 5,000. What is the reason? It is difficult to say. However, Ukraine is now doing everything to keep this trend, making strikes on the production of antennas for the MPK, the warehouses, the models themselves, and the aircraft of the carrier. We will talk about these strikes with you in the near future. In the news, Alexander Kharchenko highlights one interesting problem of Russian drone operators, which is not obvious for a non-professional look. That's what he writes. Give air retranslators FPV calculations. Our country releases like hot pies in the reports everything is fine. But is it effective? You know what is the difference between our objective control from the enemy? Ukrainians slowly fly up to the victim, aim and strike the most unprotected place. Our operators responsibly peek at the target. Except for the optofiber, our enemy has achieved such results due to the wide use of air retranslators. We still have whole brigades do not have such equipment. Rubik's Cube left. Rubik's Cube we leave behind. Scopes. I remind you, this is such a representative Russian brigade of drone operators who are provided with everything necessary. But she is such, well, if not one, then one of the few Ukrainians can get retranslators on the military marketplace for points. We have a kilobin and master a single copy on the knee, but there are no centralized supplies. The CZ complains, without air retranslators it is practically impossible to work in the ground. Because of this, the effectiveness of our drones is reduced many times. Maybe it's time to start working on the quality of use. Give the troops air retranslators, then we consider the production of millions of drones, and many of them fly to the goal. The question is asked by Kharchenko. In fact, we have a good example of why the military purchase marketplaces are introduced in Ukraine, and the system of this is actually written by Kharchenko himself. Ukrainian unmanned units have the opportunity to order what they need, including drone retranslators, while in Russia, without the knowledge of the military core, the problem is not that they do not solve, no one will find out about the highest echelons of power. It is also difficult to fix the situation with urgent assemblies. Heavy agricultural drones are often used under the retranslators, and they are not cheap, so taking into account the fall of the assemblies, most of the volunteers are not so good at it. Zidatur Old Marzov tells the most ordinary story of the life of the military during the war of drones. Such stories are connected with the Russians with a plushy end, unfortunately, not only with them. Our car was burned now, but the main thing is without a victim, Marzov writes. Before that, her engine was jammed and she decided to tow it to the rear. Well, for the enemy who noticed, imagine 2 cars in a trailer. What a target. Several drones were cut off at once. The first car was jammed, but it remained on the go. The fighters managed to jump out, fired, the rope was untied, and at all times turning off the wrap they left. But you have a farmer, he, although with a wrap, but the engine did not work, the wrap was not turned on, it remained to stand. The car wrap, as a rule, does not have an autonomous power source and starts from the engine, if anything. In fact, he distracted attention, saved people, but the kamikaze of the enemy was finished. They burned it. The guys came back when he was already burning out, and then the farmer himself bought our fighter, a guy with a wrap. The car, as you can see, was equipped, everything was as it should be. He helped the unit on all issues in general, and then the engine of the car got up. The new engine from the Caucasus was thrown over. This new engine is just in the body of the burning UAZ. The fighter himself was in the hospital injured for a couple of weeks. The combat comrades just wanted to restore the car to his return. It turned out, unfortunately, the opposite. The Z-man complains. What to say when he saw these photos in the hospital? This is the first thought, that the main thing is that the guys are safe. And with the car, he says, well, what to do? I was lucky. After all, if you think about it, this is exactly what military luck looks like. This road is often used by fighters today. If they did not drive in a trailer or someone else would drive, then a few drones in one car could not leave a chance. And then she took the fire on herself. Life and health of people are preserved. Everything is done only with iron, writes the Z-man. I will tell you this story not only to please the next failure of the Russians, but also to note that exactly the same, unfortunately, it happens regularly with Ukrainian soldiers. That is why we are so often gathering for cars and a wrap system for them. They really save lives. I remind you of the collection in the description for 2 cars for the new unit. A video appeared on the network in which a man in a partly military uniform tells the details of the operations stream. She is also known as the Operation Truba. The nuance is that the video was published in the Telegram channel Northern Channel. Earlier, SIT analysts expressed suspicions that the channel may be related to the Ukrainian chain, and I agree with them. I have a certain list. There are certain features that can be identified whether the channel is a real channel of the Russian military or not. Nevertheless, there is nothing wrong with the chain channels, especially if they are led with the mind, and the smartest strategy for chain channels is to try to integrate into this community as much as possible. That is, many Russian soldiers really have no way out, and they do not understand who to turn to, who to complain to, and they are ready, for example, to talk to such channels and send them some files. In general, despite the fact that the channel is most likely to be a chain channel or some kind of individual project, nevertheless, Astra recognized the person on the video and he turned out to be a resident of St. Petersburg. Astra talked to him. Again, he made a small concession. I note that EPSOS channels, which are exclusively engaged in faking, do not live for a long time. In a good channel of this kind, fakes should be diluted with truthful, otherwise exclusive information but real. Then the entrances will be perceived with greater confidence. In the video, the man says that the Operation Stream in the Kursk region was carried out with complete neglect of the health and safety of the military personnel. Tens of soldiers suffocated or died in panic and in a mess trying to get out of the pipe. At some point, he just could not go any further and his fellow soldiers left him on the halfway from where he was already crawling and barely. There's a lot of stuff going on here, but as you can see, YouTube killed me 2 videos yesterday because of these things, so think about it yourself. He also admitted that in addition to the darkness and the constant lack of oxygen, the soldiers also experienced difficulties with the evacuation of their comrades' corpses. There was simply no place for such maneuvers in the pipe. There were also problems with the delivery of water, which, in the end, according to the military storyteller, was taken by the fighters of the Akhmet unit. There the Akhmet unit was disassembled, they fought. The man on the video, the St. Petersburg citizen Igor Garas, in a conversation with Astrovan, refused to name the part which was attached but confirmed it earlier in the video confession. Video is all true. I cannot comment. I am a simple soldier. In order to comment and make a statement, there is a Ministry of Defense. It was generally a personal conversation, not a call. I think everything will be fixed. We will do everything. We are waiting for victory, said Garas. Although at the end of the published video, the operator addressed Igor with the words "Lubnist" and became a star, the military itself claims that this conversation was not intended for publication and does not know how the video could be in the network. Operation Storm, or Truba, is a raid of Russian military with the release of March 8, 1925, through the gas pipeline in the Kursk region for penetration in Telvasu. Russia stated that thanks to the operation, it was possible to disorient the Ukrainian forces and take several settlements. However, many military analysts note that the Ukrainian troops began retreating in advance due to threats of encirclement and overfights with supplies. The operation did not play any role. In Russian propaganda, the operation is presented as a heroically unique one. Earlier, the propagandist Anastasia Koshevrova stated that the military who received a cancer of lungs in the framework of this operation refused to pay rewards. However, they received a cancer. It is not clear, but nevertheless, another monstrous story of Ukrainian war prisoners, which needs to be continued to speak, no matter how hard it is. Valery Zelensky, a military officer of the 53rd Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Soviet Union, died in Kiev on June 16, just 23 days after the exchange of prisoners. He was 57 years old. His daughter, Sispolina Donbas, told about this. Zelensky was captured at the very beginning of the war and returned home only in May of this year as part of the exchange of thousands upon thousands. However, less than a month after liberation, his heart stopped. Doctors were unable to save a man whose organs began to refuse one after another. It is claimed that doctors diagnosed him with multiple injuries, the destruction of internal organs and necrosis tissue, as well as the decay of the organs, which could not be stopped. And there are still many military and civilian who simply do not survive until liberation. Let us remember the journalist Victoria Roskin, who was interrogated to death. For those who survive, the Russian captivity will leave an indelible mark on all life. The struggle for the exchange of all upon all must become an important track not only for Ukrainian diplomacy. The fate of Western countries is in front of those who defended peace and tranquility not only in Ukraine, but also in their countries. And another monstrous evidence of what is happening in the Russian captivity. The story has nothing to do with the so-called SVO, but it is extremely symbolic for the Russian army. The reconnaissance strike BPA Alt-Yisru, which is in the Altar people, fell yesterday morning on a private house in Santadup near Kazan. Unmanned began to be developed back in 2011, but it is still in the process of endless trials, despite the formal statement of the SAA about their end at the end of 2021. In reality, for all this time there is no information about the participation of Altius in the combat actions. Here is such a flying armada. The BPA fell due to the impact of the uninstalled REB systems, writes the commercial. The takeoff from the airfield, the base, went smoothly. Then, during the flight, the satellite navigation was violated by the uninstalled external means of REB, said the representative of the company AO-UZGA. According to him, the unmanned continued the flight under the inertial navigation system. To enter the landing, it was necessary to put the aircraft into the second circle. During the landing, an emergency situation occurred in the inertial mode. I wonder whose REB systems appeared in Kazan. The channel, a military informant, is ironic here. Another reminder that relatives of the so-called heroes of the Soviet Union do not need anyone and are forced to live in the most difficult conditions. The residents of the city of Novotelsk in the Altai region have not been able to get their problems solved by the city administration for a long time. On the streets of Fermanov, garbage trucks have broken the road, as a result of which gardens and yards of local residents, including a 70-year-old mother of 2 members of the ISVO and a 97-year-old widow of a veteran, are flooded. Due to an action by the administration, pensioners cannot even get out of the courtyards normally. Here is this puddle, and now it turns out that the grandmothers are running to the house. Here is their gate that their second gate is practically constantly blocked. They cannot go here. At the same time, the pensioners have already tried to solve the problem with their own strength, but they do not have enough money for this. Why should people order the land themselves, pour it all away, repair the roads, remove this garbage that lies here, all the garbage? The woman who recorded the video says in outrage that the people who gave their sons to the war now have no one to help the middle problems, for the solution of which the city administration of Novotelsk should answer. Guys, what are they fighting for? They are fighting for these puddles. They are fighting everywhere. They are showing everywhere that the SVL family is helping the SVL family. Show us your help, please. But globally, this is Putin's idea. Putin's idea is not that the Russians should live better. Putin's idea is that all the rest should also live in Beep, well, in the state in which Putin brought Russia. Of course, usually in this place the Zetniks talk about Moscow and how it got better, but Moscow is not Russia. And in Moscow itself there were problems. Well, how do those who gave their children to the war live? You can see for yourself. If what is called they prevented this, then now they lived calmly with their sons who would help them to fix everything that is destroyed. And now their children are most likely lying in the grave, and if not, they will soon be there. My name was Michael Nacke, and see you soon. All the best. Bye.